Welcome back to the DePIN State Show presented by Eclipse. I'm Nick Hawks. On today's episode, we have Abhay coming back from Helium Foundation. This show is sponsored by Eclipse Builders. If you're pushing the limits of what's possible on chain, you should build your own rollup with Eclipse. And we'll have a little bit more on them later in the show. Abhay, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Nick. Thanks for having me back.
I'm super excited to have you back. We got a lot to talk about in Helium Land. So let's kick it off with DC usage. We had two big spikes. One was good, one was bad. Let's start off with the bad so that we can finish up with the good. And that was the IoT exploit that some jackwagon decided it was a good idea to try and steal. Can you walk me through kind of what happened?
For sure. So it looks like somebody figured out that they could take advantage of a setting called multibuy in the Helium Foundation console. So specifically, that is Helium Foundation money that they were able to run away with. And history of the network, like we've never went back and clawed back anything from anyone who earned, any hotspot owner that earned. I think it's actually really important that we don't do that ever. And so, like it is what it is. They figured out an exploit. We were able to patch it. They did some clever things, like they were able to automate creation of devices and orgs on Helium Foundation console to sort of take advantage of this. And we were able to find it thanks to some of that automation, but also thanks to just like some good sleuthing from the community. To be honest, like I think the community started seeing this before we did on our own console, and that's something for us to learn here. We should be paying more attention specifically to our own console, and not just being excited about, hey, look, DC growth. Which I certainly was, and I'll sort of take personal responsibility there. Like I was very excited about it. I thought it was real. I was like, this is really great. The one thing that I will say that I'm happy to hear, happy about with all this situation is that it actually tells us something about the Helium packet router, that it can actually take on this additional packet load or perceived packet load that might be coming from hotspots. And that
silver lining
to me, that's a small silver lining that I'm going to take. And, when that traffic is real at that level, the packet router will be able to handle it, which is good.
Cool. That's great. Yeah. And I got hit by the same or a similar exploit over on the Mayeo Scientific console. So I know that Paul and I I look at this stuff as like, hey, this is part of growing an ecosystem is you're going to have bad actors in there. And it's really our responsibility and almost like their responsibility to try and find the exploits and our responsibility to try and, fix it to make the system better for everyone. So the very thin silver lining is that it's sometimes okay to have hackers in the system just because they show you where the weaknesses are.
One thing I will say is that there is,
let's see.
Sorry, Nick. One thing I will say is that there is another option for folks that are finding exploits like this that are legitimate, which is if they feel so inclined, they could always reach out to the foundation and do a responsible disclosure. Right? That's another sort of well-known path in security research. If you find an exploit like this that particularly has an economic impact on the Helium network, rather than waiting for us to find it and shut it down and potentially shut down real devices on, along the way. Let's talk.
Love it. Let's see. I did forget to say like and subscribe, so make sure you hit the like and subscribe button on the YouTube video. If I don't say that, Max will cut my throat.
Is it that way, the good news. That way or that way?
Yeah, it's one of these ways. It's up there. You'll figure it out. You can't figure it out to watch. Let's see. So the good news in DC Spike was that mobile turned on. I've been watching that on the Dune page, and I think they've displaced Mayeo Scientific for the top 10. So they're running some DC through there. What do you expect that ramp up to be? How's the network handling it? Like, what's the viewpoint from the first kind of opening days?
It's just a couple of days, right? So they, if you drill down into the data, it looks like they settle on chain every 4 hours, which is sort of useful to know that, if you're not seeing any activity for 4 hours, that's probably why. So that's good to know. And the other thing that it's very early, right? There aren't a whole lot of hotspots out there in the first place on the mobile network, and there also aren't there isn't a whole lot of usage yet. And I would say this is just probably the beginning. I'm also sure that some of those folks are probably like doing a lot of testing, right? I think someone the other day posted a meme that basically said to watch a lot of Netflix or something like that. Is what it is. They are paying for it, so I would say that, and I know this one is actually paying for it, thankfully.
Yeah. It's always, and I mean that's part of figuring out these things is that we launch them and fix it as we go. So that's super cool. Let's see. Next up, there's kind of two parts to this. The easy part is Helium manufacturers and onboarding fees with Bobcat. I've had a couple folks reach out to me and say, hey, Bobcat's not onboarding. I know the MCC has discussed this. Any kind of take on real, like more structurally as far as the ecosystem? What happens when manufacturers say we're not going to fund the onboarding account?
Well, I think ultimately, a manufacturer, when they sell you a piece of hardware, they're making you a promise, and that's a promise that should be kept. And ultimately, like I think they like the consumer and the manufacturer need to try to work that out. And if that doesn't work, that's when folks should probably come to the community and say, what else can we do? There is this MCC entity, Nick, which you've been a part of in
Don't
the
go throw
past.
me under the bus.
In the past, right? And you've been like a very, very like, kind of crucial part of that, and I obviously appreciate that, and the community does too. And I think that the MCC, I think, probably needs a little more teeth, is my thought there, and I think it'd be good if the community grants it more authority
Yep.
to allow it to do certain things, like hold a maker more accountable. In the cases of the sort of like truly kind of folks that are trying to like
Yeah,
get away with
the
something.
egregious breaches. Yep.
Yeah, with Bobcat specifically, I don't think that's the case. They've been a great partner to a lot of folks in our ecosystem.
Yeah.
They continue to be making hotspots. I know they had a gap in funding their data credits for onboarding. They fixed that gap recently, and I think hotspots, at least the last couple of days, have been onboarded successfully. I
Cool.
appreciate that they came back. That's great. But I want to make sure that the community has, like, in the case of an actual issue, like, does the community have the right sort of advocacy for these devices? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to talk like long term, what I'd love to see, but like, maybe happy to talk about that a little bit too.
I
I think this fact that we have an onboarding server and like this sort of data credit burden that exists, and I'll set aside my opinions on whether or not we should change the onboarding fee or not, because I think there's a good conversation there too. But
Sure.
today there is a fee that should be paid. I think it makes sense for those funds to be held in escrow until the hotspot gets onboarded. And I think there are ways to do this entirely on chain. Actually had a engineering design discussion yesterday about this, where every single sale issues you a onboarding NFT, and when you receive your hotspot, you can redeem that onboarding NFT and onboard the thing on chain. And I think that's a lot more possible now that we're on Solana, where this stuff is a lot cheaper to do and a lot simpler to do. And I think we can work with manufacturers to make this sort of escrow sort of system, on-chain escrow system work. But
Yeah.
it requires some engineering, but I'd love to build towards that.
Yep. I mean, it brings up the next thing, which is kind of a sticky wicket with this FreedomFi thinking that it's what they're aiming to do is say like, hey, we're actually going to switch these so they're not mobile hotspots. But let's do a background on that first. So HIP 53 set an onboarding fee for hotspots to $40. HIP 51 was this thing where it's like, it's not about how much you pay. It's just that you say that you paid it. So there's a little bit of a weirdness in there. And then there's also in one of those HIPs, I think it was 53, it said any economic change to either has to be a HIP. So now we've got HIP 89, which was, if I'm getting it right, fixes code that was implemented incorrectly in the move to Solana. So we're just kind of fixing a bug. But if I'm getting it right, there's a problem with FreedomFi saying like, hey, we're not going to pay these DCs. We're not going to pay these onboarding fees because we just want mobile hotspots. But I totally may be messing that up. Do you want to walk me through that?
Yeah, I can try to correct some of that, or at least
Yeah,
like walk through some of that. I mean,
totally
history
correct it. Yeah.
is, yeah, I mean, the history is really simple. Like the history is that we had one chain with one kind of hotspot, right? And that the one kind of hotspot had one kind of onboarding transaction, and that required $40. The history also is that we had it was just an IoT hotspot as well. It wasn't sort of perceived to be a mobile hotspot. When FreedomFi hotspots specifically that you could plug in a radio and mine mobile were onboarded onto that chain, those through the HIP 53 process,
Yep.
there wasn't any like, here is a new onboarding transaction sort of implemented at the time, wasn't the expectation at the time, and we started, and now we're kind of where we are. The other thing that happened along the way is that we did the Solana migration, and during the Solana migration, the implementation was a decision was to sort of match what was already there on the Helium L1 as much as we could, and this is
Yep.
also a case where we did that. So the other thing that I think is relevant to talk about, and we had two HIPs that were proposed by the community right before the migration to try to resolve this issue, and unfortunately, neither of them passed. And I I I know the community tried, right? So to
Yeah.
give to the community's credit and those authors credit, like tried to go through it. We made sure that they got to a vote before the migration, and we were prepared. The devs in the Helium ecosystem were prepared to make the changes that were sort of reflected in either of those HIPs. I think one was, if I remember correctly, one was like drop the A score entirely, and the other one was drop the fee part of the A score. I'm actually not remembering
Yep.
exactly, so maybe we should. I don't know.
Don't tempt Max to come in here and yell at you for not knowing
I know
every
he'll
word
yell
of
at
his
me for
hip.
this now. I know for not remembering every single
Right.
character, and
Right.
he deserves it. He deserves the right to sort of defend his hips.
So
But
we're in
I
this
think that
spot. I guess. Go ahead.
yeah, the unfortunate part is that we're in the spot where we are right now, which
Yep.
is, you know, I guess those authors kind of knew that. I'm not surprised. I would ask them not to come in and say, "I told you so." Please don't, authors. But like I think it is important to acknowledge that the community and these authors did try to resolve this back then. So
Yep.
where are we today? I mean, I think the community is still actively discussing this, and
Yep.
so personally, and as a foundation, like we really don't have an opinion on this yet. We'd like this to actually be resolved in the community, and and hopefully will be soon. But if the conversation goes on for a very long time and it actually is causing harm to the network, that might be a
Yep.
place where we might come in and say something. So I want to make sure that we have a healthy conversation.
Yeah.
Like, no one's at hopefully no one's like throwing too much mud at each other on this thing.
No, no,
And
and I
let's
think
yeah.
yeah, I mean Nova
Go
and
ahead.
Freedom Five have been around for a long time. I'm sure that they're going to sort this thing out and get it sorted out to the benefit of the community as a whole. So I think that's always the interesting thing is that we've got these players who are all have the kind of community's best interests in mind, and I kind of
Mhm.
expect everyone to work it out. I expect it to be a little contentious as we go through, but that's fine. That means that everybody's
That's
passionate.
okay.
That's what we want.
Contentious is fine, right?
Yeah. Yep. Love it. Dig it. So one of the super cool parts about doing this show is we get to talk to tons of projects across the space, including some of the geeky back end nerdy stuff that help deepen projects like Helium and like other projects. One of those is the show sponsor Eclipse, Eclipse Builders. They're a customizable roll up provider, and they're deploying app specific chains for a lot of different DePIN projects. They allow you to pick your own virtual machine, your base layer, and any additional customizations, and enable new functionality for your DApps. They're super committed to helping projects build on DePIN. They're a sponsor of this show. Check them out at Eclipse Builders and click the card above for a link to a interview that we did with them. Yeah, it's been super fun to kind of work with them and to talk to Neil. That guy's just
Mhm.
super fired up, and it's like talking to those people sometimes makes my brain hurt because they're so smart. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I've actually met Neil. He lives in the Bay Area. I've actually had the opportunity to talk a lot about Oracle networks with him, and we've sort of definitely thrown around some ideas.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, and
sharp. Yeah,
I've sort of floated this idea to him that they should propose a solution to decentralize oracles for the IoT subdel. So if they come
okay.
up with one, I think we should listen. Um,
Yeah, that'd be super cool. It's always nice to see people working across the different projects. Um, One thing, so this next one is kind of the big sticky thing that I'm seeing that Max and I have been watching play out over the past couple months is that we've got these three different tokens. We got HNT, IoT, and mobile. And in the beginning, it kind of made sense if you really paid attention. But at this point, it seems like in the community at large, there's a fair amount of confusion about what they do and how they work together, even though it's all kind of laid out. And if you really read it and pay attention, you can sort through the web. Um, I think one of the things I'm starting to see, that Max and I are starting to see, as we talk to a bunch of different people across the space, is that no one understands why we want to have smaller and smaller, smaller in the sense of size tokens. And then the other thing is, was this, I won't put words in your mouth. This is the questions that we get. Was this a mistake? And then the question that I've got for you is, do you see this, if the community thinks that it was a mistake, being something that could potentially be undone? And if so, how?
Hmm. I mean, was this a mistake is a tough thing, right? Like we are still very early in the launch of the IoT token, and although the mobile token has been around since summer of last year, late summer of last year. It really hasn't had a market. It hasn't had a ton of time. The HIP 51 uh, was sort of designed over a year ago,
Yeah.
and really implemented over the last several months. Like I would actually argue that it didn't really finish until we moved to Solana, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
It took a while for us to implement all the bits of it as a community. So like I think that we like is the like do we know the experiment is a success or a failure? I think the answer is no. I think it's actually fairly early. Um, so you know I will say a couple of things about this. One, um, is it confusing to have three separate tokens, really four separate tokens if you count data credits? I think yes, of course, it is.
Yeah.
Like four is more complex than two, right? Which is what we had
My
before.
math is not that good, but yeah, four is more complex than two.
Yeah, like look, like it's twice as many tokens, right? And
Yep.
so,
Yep.
purely at the face of that, I have to listen. And so that's why,
Sure.
like this is an interesting question. And thinking through this as we're talking, by the way, I think the other thing that is important, is that, these tokens were also created to give each sort of network, each subnetwork, their own sovereignty. And I think that is actually a really powerful thing to give the IoT network and the IoT hotspot owners and the IoT sensor deployers their own sovereignty and their own rights to do something, but still be able to be tied into a larger ecosystem that is complementary, right? And that's really
Yep.
what, all of the other sub DAOs, if someone came in and said, we should build I don't know, a rocket launch sub DAO, I'd be like, that has nothing to do with Helium. Like,
Right.
literally makes no sense unless that rocket launch had a satellite on it and that satellite had something to do with Helium.
Some kind of DePIN. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
then, right? But like, that's
Yeah.
a stretch already.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think it's important to, you know, these networks need their own sovereignty, and that's sort of the fundamental concept of having their own subtokens, but still be able to tie back to HNT. And that's sort of the design of IoT. That's the design of mobile, and you can actually see that each of the sub networks have their own governance and their own like stakeholders, right? I think it is, and it's important to acknowledge that they are very different. And so
Yep.
that's like the other reaction that I have to it. I think your other very pointed question, which I think is a reasonable one, and I'm not going to speak too much on the engineering, uh, thoughts here because I would want to actually spend time scoping it,
Yep.
um, and thinking about it very deeply from an engineering perspective. But like, could we go back to two? Yes, of course. Like, given sufficient time, sufficient engineers, and sufficient communication, I think the answer is yes. I think there's some real questions that the community would need to figure out. One is today the foundation and Nova have a significant amount of mobile tokens. What happens to that? That was through the pre-mine that was authorized by HIP 53.
Yep.
The other thing is that the IoT subDAO also had a pre-mine. It was much smaller, but does
Yep.
exist. That didn't go to any individual entity. We went to a lot of entities, and a lot of whom were, many of whom were actual validators for our original L1. So I do want to sort of acknowledge that is, back to that other point that I made. Like, I don't believe in clawbacks, so I think we need to
Yep.
figure out a way to make them whole if we do anything. And
Yeah.
that's a community conversation that needs to happen if this is more than the one chat that you might have had. Hopefully there were more than one for us to bring it up. But like, yeah, I would say that like uh, we will enable the conversation. The foundation will enable the conversation if that's something that needs to come up, because
Yeah.
it is, it's real, right? So
It's
I don't want
definitely.
to,
Yeah. Yeah. It's
but
something
like, I don't
that.
want to rush into things, right? I also want to make
No.
sure that
No.
we are thinking it through correctly. What is the social impact? What's the economic impact? Like, there's also an optics impact here. It was pretty widely broadcasted that there would be these other tokens.
Yep.
I'm not sure what the world outside of Helium, our bubble inside of Helium, will think of like us going back on this.
Yeah.
So it'd be important for me to like think about that a little bit, because the just in some ways the reputation of our network does matter, and I want to make sure that we're
Sure.
not like we're not seen as sort of like economically uh, flighty, right? And like sort of
Yeah.
make quick decisions. We've made a lot of economic changes over the last several years. Like I made the first one in HIP 10. This is way long ago, when we sort of made sure there was a cap on how much you earn HNT for your data credit usage. HIP 20, HIP 51, like these are all like pretty large economic changes
Yep.
um, in the span of just under 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this, for me, this demonstrates why you're doing such a good job running as CEO. The Helium
I
Foundation is like,
appreciate
hey,
that. Yeah.
is being, yeah, thank you, being open to like, hey, this is a crazy idea. This is really different than anything we've thought before, but why would we not assess it? Right, just because it's something that we haven't thought of or haven't considered before doesn't mean that it's wrong. And I really appreciate just how kind of open and transparent you are about that. So I think we'll kind of push that back to the community. I'm expecting at some point, if I keep hearing all this stuff, I'm hearing that we're going to see a HIP come out about this. But for right now, it's good to get the first take on that
Yeah,
from
and
you.
if anyone writes this HIP, and if they're listening, I'm happy to talk through it with them, right? Like I
Okay.
think the thing that I've generally been open to is anyone who has sort of a reasonable and like, a reasonable like sort of proposal that's economic or technical, like if it needs clarification. Obviously, it's not an endorsement in any way of that HIP, but I'm happy to like at least help review
Sure.
it. Yeah,
Sure.
it
Yeah.
in
I
any
mean,
way that I can. Yeah.
yeah, I appreciate it. I'm sure. Well, carefully, your inbox is going to get swamped. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I
is the
think
job.
on the surface of it, I really like the simplicity of the idea of like, hey, we just have HNT and DC, but man, there's no way that you can get around the fact that even if every conversation from here forward is like, oh yeah, everybody's on board with doing this, which is not going to happen. Even if that was true, it's still an enormous amount of work. So I want to make sure that this show is a place to explore these ideas with the folks who are a part of them, but also just kind of know in the background like that's a pretty big thing. Cool. The last thing I got is some littler news, and that's the location assertion cost decrease. I
Hmm.
just saw the announcement about that the other day. That never was a big deal to me. I'm not moving my hotspots around a bunch anymore. I'm not like chasing these paragliding competitions and putting them on. But are you seeing any kind of impact from that, or anything that you're any comments on that?
We haven't actually done any deep analysis on
Yeah,
whether one of the sorry to go back to the HIP specifically, it
sure.
was HIP 69 that was approved by the community, implemented at the time of transition. What it did specifically was reduce the assert location fee to $5 worth of data credits instead of 10. And the intention of that was that we would spend 3 months sort of to seeing if that actually changed activity, if that actually moved hotspots around more. The assumption was with systems like HIP 15 and 17, there is already an economic sort of advantage of like potentially moving your hotspot out of like San Francisco where I live, because putting another hotspot here makes no sense. So maybe even like
Right.
folks that have hotspots here might move it somewhere else, right? So
Yep.
that was the initial intention. And I know was it Max had that like hotspot rescue like company that was trying to stand up. I forget exactly who it was, but like there's this idea of like buy this hotspot from one place and have it be put somewhere else. And I know some guys in LA were also looking at doing this and building a business around it as well. Um,
Yeah.
uh, and so yeah, so I think there's uh, that was the intention. This was like an even more explicit, hey, let's just reduce the fee and see what happens. It was
Yep.
supposed to be temporary for 3 months. It was implemented to be to at the time of transition. We're at the 30-day mark before that has to be reverted back.
Right.
And so a reasonable question to the community is like, do you want to keep it as is? And if you do, like, we need a HIP for it, and this HIP would come from the community again. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that is that's something I actually think I saw a pull request already where someone from the IoT working group has actually already written a HIP. I think that was this morning that I saw it. I didn't dive
Yep.
into it yet, but
Okay.
if it's out there, we'll get it into governance and we'll make sure it's discussed. And should be a fairly straightforward vote, I think. Like, I don't know if anyone needs
Hopefully.
to.
Yeah. Hopefully it's not
Yeah.
too contentious.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
either way, like clarity is actually maybe the most important thing because there is some engineering work that needs to be put in
Yeah.
that we need some clarity on. Again, I don't want this to be a situation where it's like, well, hey, there's some engineering work that needs to be done. Which way does the community want us to go here? And like, we're happy to
Yep.
go in either direction.
Yeah, and I think thank God this one's like for me at least, I think this seems like a much smaller impact than some of the other things we've discussed today. And really, it should be pretty clear as to whether or not it worked or not. There's confounding factors that are greater than just the Helium ecosystem, but it should be pretty clear, like, yeah, this thing worked really well, or it didn't work, or we can't tell, in which case I would say it didn't work. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
I mean, if I can throw my opinion in there,
Yeah,
I
your
genuinely
personal
believe
opinion. Yeah.
that, personal opinion, I genuinely believe that hotspot fees should be lowered, and I don't think hotspot fees should be counted as protocol revenue. Like protocol revenue is data credits that are burned for the purposes of moving data on the network.
Right.
And that's what we really should focus on. And the reality is, I think most people assume that that's what protocol revenue is. I think there are a few
Yep.
folks out there that like try to conflate onboarding fees with protocol revenue. And I think
Yep.
I don't think that's correct personally.
No.
So in a way, like if we could reduce all fees to zero, like I'd love to figure that out. I think there's some value in Sybil resistance and there's some value in spam prediction. And so, put a fee on these things, but I think we can lower a lot of these fees.
Yeah. I don't know. If Helium Foundation hires Golden Hawks as business advisors, we'll be jacking the fees up because we got to have revenue somehow.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
If we hire them, you have to keep the fees high.
It will cost you money for sure. Yeah, it'll cost the community money, but it'll be good for the foundation long term. Okay, cool. I've taken up enough of your time. I know you have other stuff to do. Thanks a ton for spending extra time with me to go through all that.
Of course.
Abhay, is super cool of you. Really excited to have you back on the next time we have an update. And then, yeah, if you haven't hit the like or subscribe button yet, make sure that you do so that you get great interviews like these with Abhay when they drop. Yeah, up, down, left, right.
Wherever,
it's on the screen somewhere. Cool. Thanks, Abhay.
Thanks, Nick.